Well, Karen Ball and Patrick Furlong have taught their spring term course, Plagues and Peoples, at Alma College for many years, but never before have they taught it in exactly the same circumstances we faced in 2021, roughly 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Tim Rath, the editor of the Tartan magazine, and I spoke with Doctors Ball and Furlong as well as their students to better understand the spring term course and the unique situation it's being taught in.
Well, it's really a course in world history seen through the perspective of the impact of epidemics in history. We look at the way in which history shaped the context in which epidemics occurred, look at the responses to the epidemics, and then how the epidemics shaped later events. We also want students to understand the biology of the particular diseases, the epidemiology, in other words, the how the disease is transmitted, right? How it makes you sick, what the disease itself is, how it happens.
The primary text that we utilize is McNeill's classical text called Plagues and Peoples. And this is really a romp through all of human history, from prehistory right up through the 1918 flu epidemic, pandemic, I should say. And so we look at that, and as a result, as Patrick said, this is a course that, from a historical perspective, we look at history, world history across millennia. But with that general context, then, there are very specific diseases that we focus on, and so we refer to those as our case studies. And so the primary case studies that we then go back and we delve into the features of those studies more explicitly would be the plague, the Black Death, the smallpox, and smallpox specifically as it was introduced in the Americas. We talk about the cholera epidemic and the impact of the cholera epidemic as it related to colonial relationships, particularly between the British and India. And then we move toward the modern epidemics, the 1918 flu pandemic, as well as then the HIV/AIDS. So those would be our case studies. The materials that we use, in some respects, if you look at them, you would say, well, these are dated. And yet it's the dated materials that I think were most important, particularly this year, because it's the dated materials that allow them to understand these epidemics, and allows them to understand what these responses were, particularly with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, hearing the contemporaneous positions of those that were working on these epidemics. And so I think particularly about the scientists, and I think about as we're looking at a NOVA program on the 1918 flu epidemic, and you have a scientist who says, with our surveillance, our ability for worldwide surveillance, our ability to generate vaccines, our ability to treat, we're not going to see an influenza epidemic like this again. When we taught this 2 years ago, there was a very different reaction from us, a very different reaction from the students than there is now. And so in many respects, I think the difference is not in what we were presenting and asking the students to think about, but the difference is in how we reacted to it, and the difference is in how the students reacted to that. To be able to read a scholarly article laying out the denialism of HIV/AIDS in South Africa, and to read the quotation from one of the denialists who says, if we simply stop testing for HIV, we will eliminate AIDS. And to suddenly recognize that that quote could have been pulled directly from any of the media in 2020, 2021 is pretty powerful.
And then, of course, simply the format of the class this year has been very different. It had to be taught very differently from previously because we had to be socially distanced. We had a larger group. We could not be in the classroom where we've always taught this course. So we ended up in Presbyterian Hall, which is the principal auditorium of the college. So it's a huge facility. And we're not used to doing the lecture component from the stage. We had to deal with the technology of that so that the students could hear and see the screen with the PowerPoint slides and so forth. But then there also was the challenge of they could hear us better than we could hear them, particularly if they were sitting further back, and they often couldn't hear each other. So we knew that was going to be an issue. So we did what we've never done before, and instead of doing all our discussion, and there's a lot of discussion in this class, I'm usually much more lecture oriented, more traditional in the way I teach classes, but in this one we've always had a lot of discussion. But we couldn't just do it in the large group. So they were divided into groups. And Karen set up the groups very deliberately in a certain way.
So in assigning the groups, we made sure that every group was a mixture of history student, science student, and blended the students across all three divisions, so that the science students would be learning from the history students, and the history students would be learning from the science students, and I think that worked really, really well. And the other thing that certainly can't be lost is we talk about experiential learning at Alma. What better environment to learn about epidemics, pandemics, and public health responses than to be taking a course where you are sitting socially distanced and everyone is in masks.
Yeah, actually, Dr. Furlong, he made this really good point that students of history tend to sort of float towards that rationalism point of view where humans have everything totally under control, we know what we're doing, and there's a rational explanation for everything, but we have to sort of step back and think about how things like bacteria, viruses, all of these different pathogens that cause disease are really more at the top of the food chain than we realize, and they impact our behavior a lot more than we like to give credit. We're not always in that sort of preventative mode or in control, really. A lot of history has been reactionary as a response to disease.
One thing that stuck out to me was like, we kind of know all the science now, so it's easy to look back and be like, oh, why the heck did they do that, you know? And it, but learning what they knew at the time and then their actions as a result of what they actually knew, it helped me understand more the evolution of scientific understanding of diseases. Like with the influenza pandemic, they had just figured out bacteria and how that causes viruses, but the flu is, not a virus, how bacteria causes infection and disease. But when the flu started, they did the same processes to try and discover the bacteria that was the causative agent of the flu. But of course, it's a virus, which is much smaller, so it was going through their filters and it wasn't showing up in the microscopes. And so that kind of reverted their thinking back to a miasmic theory where diseases come from bad air and away from bacteriologists. And just so understanding why science isn't exactly linear in progression, I think was something really good that I'll take into my future career here at Alma.